The gift arrived 3 days before the Garden of the Year judging. It was a 5-gallon bucket of dark, pungent slurry, presented with a triumphant, almost vibrating, smile by my neighbor of 30 years. "Susan, it's my new secret weapon." "Margaret," she announced, her voice dripping with a false, syrupy generosity. "A new, homemade organic fertilizer. You must use it. It will guarantee your 11th win." She pushed it toward me, her knuckles white on the handle. She expected me to be grateful. She expected me to clap my hands together and be the trusting, sentimental 72-year-old woman she had cultivated and mocked me for being. She expected me to rush to my prize-winning David Austin roses, the ones that were the heart of my legacy, and douse them in her gift. My expression did not change. My breathing was even. What Susan didn't know, what she could never comprehend in her greedy, arrogant mind, was that her gift was the final act of a war I had been documenting for years. She had no idea that her secret weapon was a fatal, clumsy miscalculation, and she had just handed me the very tool of her own destruction. That garden was not just a hobby. It was the last living piece of my husband, David. I had won the town competition for 10 years straight. But that prize, that blue ribbon, meant nothing compared to the legacy. David and I had built that garden from bare seas, unforgiving clay, his strong hands building the cedar trellises, my hands planting the heritage roses he had ordered from England. Every bloom was a specific memory of him. The Graham Thomas's yellow climbing rose was the one he planted the day our first grandchild was born. The deep crimson Mr. Lincoln was the one he surprised me with for our 40th anniversary, because he knew it had the most powerful, beautiful scent. After he passed, that garden became my sanctuary. It was where I went to grieve, to feel close to him. It was a living, breathing archive of our marriage, a testament to a love that was quiet, and deep, and real. And Susan knew it. She had watched me. I remember, in those first few months after David's funeral, I would be on my knees in the dirt, tears streaming down my face, unable to even see the weeds I was pulling. Susan would appear at the fence. She never came to help. She came to watch. She would stand there, holding a casserole dish as a prop, her head tilted, in that perfect mask of pity. "Oh, Margaret," she would coo, her voice a poison of its own. "It's just like David is still here with you. Isn't it?" She used my grief as a conversational tool, a way to signal her own faux compassion to the rest of the neighborhood. I now realized that while I was on my knees, my heart shattered. She was looking at me not with pity, but with a simmering, sociopathic jealousy. She wasn't just jealous of the garden, she was jealous of the love it represented. While I was sacrificing my emotional energy to preserve that legacy, she was sacrificing hers to research industrial-grade herbicides. She didn't just want to kill my plants. She wanted to kill my memory of him. She wanted to prove that her bitterness was stronger than my love. And for that, there would be no forgiveness, only consequences. She was my best friend. 30 years, 3 decades of shared coffees, of neighborhood gossip, of exchanged Christmas cards. I had always been kind. I had always been the peacemaker. Enduring her subtle digs, her accidental insults, and her passive-aggressive jealousy for the sake of neighborhood peace. I remembered the year, 5 or 6 summers ago, when her entire tomato crop was hit with a vicious late-season blight. She was hysterical, knowing she would lose her entire harvest. I had been planning to go to the state fair that weekend, a trip I had looked forward to for months. I canceled my trip. I sacrificed my one vacation that summer. I spent 48 hours, an entire Saturday and Sunday, on my knees in her yard. My own garden neglected. I applied my own proprietary fungicide, a mixture I had perfected in my old lab, trimming away the diseased branches until my hands were raw and aching. I saved her crop. She had wept with gratitude, clutching my sore hands. "Margaret, I would have lost everything. You are the kindest friend. The kindest. The vile, Acidic irony was nauseating. Just last week, I had spent 2 hours in her yard, patiently showing her how to properly prune her roses to avoid black spot. My hands aching from the effort, my knees protesting on her hard clay. And while I was doing that, sacrificing my own precious preparations for the competition to help her, she was looking at my hands not with gratitude, but with absolute contempt. She was smiling and nodding, her eyes flicking back to my garden, thinking I was a senile old fool, a sentimental pushover, while I was teaching her how to save a plant. She was finalizing her plan to kill mine. She saw my patience, my 30 years of kindness, not as a gift, but as a flaw, a profound weakness to be exploited. That was the mistake that would cost her everything. I stood on my porch, looking at the bucket of poison she had just handed me. I am not just a gardener, I am a retired botanist. My useless knowledge, as she had once called it at a neighborhood barbecue. Oh, Margaret, you and your science, it's just dirt. Deer was my weapon. She had mocked my career for decades, dismissing my life's work as a quirky little hobby. And now, she was bringing this crude, clumsy attack to my very doorstep. She was bringing a child's chemistry set to fight a master chemist. I leaned down, pretending to admire the slurry. I didn't need a lab. I could smell it immediately, beneath the cloying, sweet smell of manure. A mask was a faint, sharp, almost electric tang, the unmistakable odor of a petroleum-based solvent, the carrier for a commercial-grade herbicide. She had almost, been smart enough to mask it. "Susan, this is too kind," I said, my voice perfectly flat. I picked up the bucket. She was beaming, her eyes fixed on my rose bushes, visibly imagining her victory. She was waiting for me to use it. "You know," I said, "as a thank you, I must give the first dose to that beautiful azalea I gifted you last month." Before she could process the words, I was walking across the lawn to her front porch. The azalea in question was a prize. A rare crimson-tide cultivar I had spent months nurturing from a cutting. Another gesture of a friendship she had been betraying. "It will make it shine for the judges," I said. Susan's face froze. Her smile collapsed into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. It was a masterful checkmate. She could not, physically could not, stop me without screaming. "No, don't. That bucket is poison." She was trapped by her own lie. She was forced to stand there, paralyzed on my lawn, and watch in silent, abject horror as I poured her secret weapon all over her own beautiful front porch plant. The next 3 days were a masterclass in psychological torture. The stress of knowing what she had done, of knowing I was living next to a sociopath, was immense. My blood pressure, which I monitored daily, was high. I had to sip chamomile tea just to keep my hands from shaking. But I held it in. I tended to my garden, which remained, of course, perfectly healthy. Susan, on the other hand, was vibrating with a gleeful, arrogant energy. She sent me texts, each one a little stab. "Hope you used my gift. It's powerful stuff," she texted the first night, while I was struggling to sleep, my mind racing. She was sending winking emojis, savoring my impending doom. Her cruelty was a performance. She would watch me from her window, a smug, a hateful smirk on her face. She would wave, looking good. "Neighbor," she called out. Her voice, a song of fake cheer. She was like a child on Christmas Eve, waiting to open her present. And that present was my total, abject ruin. On the day of the judging, Susan arrived early. She stood beside me as the 3 judges from the town garden club walked up my path. Her face was a perfect mask of fake sympathy, her eyes wide, her hand ready to comfort me when they saw the devastation. I watched her face as the judges gasped. Her smirk widened, a flicker of pure triumph. And then, her expression curdled. She turned from fake pity to absolute, confused horror. The judges were gasping not in shock, but in awe. "Margaret, the head judge?" Eleanor said, her voice full of wonder. It's the best it has ever looked. The heritage roses are flawless. The scent is divine." Susan's jaw went slack. She stared at my garden, her eyes screaming, "Why aren't you dead?" The judges finished their scoring and moved on, walking the 20 yards to Susan's front porch. I walked with them. Susan was frozen in place, a statue of failure on my lawn, paralyzed by her own confusion. The judges stopped dead. They stared, horrified, at the plant on Susan's porch. The crimson-tide azalea I had fertilized was now a shriveled, blackened, chemically burned husk. The herbicide had worked perfectly. It smelled of sulfur and death. "Susan," Eleanor said, her voice cold with disgust. "This is appalling neglect. That plant is diseased and toxic. We can't possibly judge the rest of your yard." Susan was disqualified. As the judges marked a 0 on their clipboards, I stepped forward, my voice trembling with practiced, perfect concern. "Oh dear. Susan," I said, loud enough for all of them to hear. "What on earth happened to that lovely azalea I gave you?" The humiliation from the judging was absolute. Susan didn't speak to me for a week. She was a pariah on the street, scurrying from her car to her front door, avoiding eye contact. But I knew that her silence was not surrender. It was calculation. 2 weeks after her public disgrace, the email went out: "Emergency meeting, urgent financial review." It was sent by Susan to every single member of the town garden club. The club, a pillar of our 65-plus community, was my second home. I had been the volunteer treasurer for 20 years. It was a position of honor, a legacy of trust built on 2 decades of thankless work. Susan, having failed to destroy my garden, was now attempting to burn down the other half of my life. For 20 years, I had guarded that small fund. I balanced those books to the penny, by hand, every single month. It was a sacrifice of my time. It was hours of my life spent, hunched over a desk, cross-referencing receipts for mulch and fertilizer, managing the petty cash for the spring bake sale, chasing down $50 membership dues. It was my integrity, a quiet, a meticulous service I performed for the community I loved. It was work I had done while David was alive, and it was work I continued after he was gone. A steady, reliable rhythm in a life that had been shattered by grief, and Susan had always pretended to be my greatest supporter in that role. "Margaret, I don't know how you do it," she would say at the meetings, clutching my arm. "All those numbers, you are just so diligent. We would be lost without you." Her flattery was a disease. I realize now that while I was sacrificing my evenings, my eyes straining to read tiny receipts, meticulously handwriting entries in those rustic ledgers, she was what she was watching. She was waiting. While I was ensuring every dollar was accounted for, she was scanning the digital bank statements online, looking for withdrawals she could twist. She was using my transparency as a weapon against my diligence. She thought my old-fashioned methods were a weakness, proof of my senility. She had no idea they were my armor. She wasn't just accusing me of theft. She was attacking my mind. She was painting me as a senile old woman who couldn't be trusted. She thought she was smart because she found the digital statements. She was stupid because she forgot about the paper ledgers. The meeting was packed. The air in the town hall basement was thick with anxiety and the smell of stale coffee. Susan stood at the front, next to the podium, a stack of bank statements in her hand, her smart evidence. She had dressed for the part, in a severe gray suit, her face a mask of profound, tragic concern. She looked like a woman about to deliver a eulogy. "Friends," she began, her voice trembling with manufactured sorrow. "It breaks my heart to do this." She passed out the copies of the statements. "I've reviewed the club's finances. I've found discrepancies. Over $5,000 in suspicious withdrawals in the last 6 months, all handled by Margaret." A wave of gasps. The other members, Ethel, Doris, Mary. Women I had known for 40 years looked at me with shock and, worse, with pity. This was Susan's expectation. A guaranteed win. She expected me to be flustered, confused, unable to account for digital withdrawals from memory. She expected me to cry, to protest, to look guilty and senile. I sat perfectly still. My back remained straight. I waited for her to finish. I'm not saying it was intentional. She continued, delivering the killing blow, her voice dripping with poison. But we are all getting older. Things slip. Perhaps the responsibility has just become too much. She was calling me a senile thief in front of my entire world. I thought of the poison in that bucket, the stress of that encounter, of knowing my best friend had tried to chemically destroy my husband's legacy, was still fresh. The high blood pressure I'd endured for those 3 days, the sleepless nights, the feeling of violation. Her words, "It's my new secret weapon. It will guarantee your win," echoed in my head, while I was suffering from the anxiety of her first attack. She was already planning this second one. The fertilizer attack wasn't the end. It was the beginning. She had planned this financial review before the garden judging even happened. She thought she had me trapped. If the poison failed, the slander would work. This was not a reactive attack. This was a sociopath's contingency plan. She didn't care how she destroyed me, only that I was destroyed. She had miscalculated again. I let the silence hang, let the accusation settle. I watched Susan's smug, satisfied expression as she looked at me, waiting for my collapse. I slowly stood up, carrying my heavy canvas tote bag. "Susan," I said, my voice clear and cold, carrying easily through the room. "You are absolutely right. Financial transparency is critical." I reached into my bag and pulled out my rustic ledger. And the next one, and the one after that, I placed 4 thick, leather-bound, handwritten ledgers on the table with a solid, definitive thud. You were smart to look at the bank statements, but you forgot the minutes. I opened the first ledger. The first, suspicious withdrawal. April 12th, $1,200. I turned the ledger for the club to see. Page 41, motion to approve $1,000. $200 for the new irrigation system at the Town Hall Triangle. Seconded by, oh, look, by you. Susan. There was a sharp, collective intake of breath. Susan's face went white. I continued. The next, May 3rd, $500. I flipped the page. Page 50. Approved $500 for the annual mulch delivery from Johnson's nursery. Receipt attached. I held up the paper receipt, stapled neatly to the page. I went on, one by one. For 10 minutes, every single suspicious withdrawal was matched perfectly to a handwritten minute, unattached receipt, and an approved vote. I had not just proven my innocence, I had proven my meticulous competence. The room, which had been full of pity for me, turned on Susan. Her face was a mottled, ugly crimson. She had been exposed as a malicious, incompetent fool. I looked at her. All those years of her mocking my hobby, my diligence, all those years I had sacrificed my time, 20 years of unpaid, thankless, secretarial and accounting work. Hours I could have spent with David. Hours I spent instead making sure this community club ran perfectly, while I was sacrificing those thousands of hours for these women. Susan was sitting in her clean house, contributing nothing, only plotting how to use my hard work against me. She thought my ledgers were a sign of weakness. They were a trap. "But," I said, my voice dropping into the dead silence, "since we are reviewing the finances." I flipped to the last page of the current ledger, the dues page. I ran my finger down the list. Here we are. Susan Miller. It seems, Susan, that my senile records show you haven't paid your own club dues in 3 years. The room exploded. It wasn't just gasps, it was outrage. Susan, the accuser, was a deadbeat, She was a slanderer who hadn't even paid her $50 annual fee. Eleanor, the club president, stood up, her face white with fury. Susan, this is the most despicable display I have ever seen in my life. You are expelled from this club. Effective immediately. Get out. Susan grabbed her purse, her hands shaking so badly she dropped it. She fled the room, utterly and completely destroyed. She was now a social pariah. She had lost the garden competition. She had been expelled from the garden club. She had been exposed as a liar, a slanderer, and a cheapskate. I knew this was not the end. I knew her rage would be uncontrollable. She had lost the public war. Now, she would escalate to a personal, criminal one. She would come for something irreplaceable. Susan was a ghost. After her expulsion from the club, she vanished. Her curtains were drawn, her mail piled up. The neighborhood, which thrives on public displays, was rife with gossip. But I knew this was not a retreat. It was a metamorphosis. Her public, social-based rage had failed. Twice. It had been defeated by botany and by bookkeeping. That Susan was dead. The one who emerged would be feral, stripped of all pretense, and focused on a new kind of war. I felt the quiet shift in the air. She had escalated from attacking my hobby to attacking my reputation. Now, she would come for my legacy. We shared a small shed on the property line. It was an old, rickety structure, but it held the last physical pieces of my husband. David was not a professional, but he was a passionate, gifted carpenter. His tools, his workbench, his junk, as Susan had once called it, were all in that shed. She had her lawnmower on her side. I had his memory on mine. Those tools were not just objects. They were an extension of his hands. I would go in there sometimes just to hold his favorite hammer. The wooden handle worn smooth and dark, perfectly molded to a grip that no longer existed. It was a sacrifice of my heart. Every time. To go in there and be surrounded by his absence. Yet I did it to feel close to him. His prize was his lathe. It was a beautiful, antique, cast-iron Rockwell, a machine from the 1950s. Solid and true. He had saved for 2 years to buy it. Back in 1972. I still remembered the day it arrived. The pride on his face, the way he ran his hands over the cold, green metal. Now, Margaret, he had said, his eyes shining. Now I can make you anything. And he did. He turned the beautiful maple legs for our dining table. He turned the cherry wood candlesticks we used every Christmas. He turned the small, perfect acorn-shaped finials for the antique crib our grandchildren slept in. That lathe was not junk. It was the engine of his love, a physical manifestation of his patience and his skill. I remember Susan coming over. Years ago, shortly after David had passed, I was in the shed, trying to organize, drowning in grief. Susan had followed me in, her eyes scanning the shelves. My goodness. Margaret, she had said, her voice laced with that familiar, false pity. What are you going to do with all this? Rusty junk. You should just have a service come and haul it all away. Clear out the clutter. It can't be healthy to hold on to all this. I remember nodding, too heartbroken to argue. I'll help you. Dear, she had offered, patting my arm. I can help you get rid of it. The vile, hideous contrast was sickening. While I was collapsing under the weight of my loss, sacrificing my own dignity to weep among the sawdust. She was not offering comfort. She was appraising. She was taking inventory. She was calculating the value of my husband's legacy. Waiting for the moment she could help me get rid of it. That moment came 3 days after her expulsion. I went to the shed to get a trowel and stopped dead. The door was slightly ajar. My side of the shed was empty, but it wasn't a simple robbery. It was an act of pure, distilled hatred. She hadn't just taken what was valuable. She had curated the destruction. David's small hand tools, his worn hammer, his favorite chisels. The measuring tape he had used his entire life were gone. I found them later, tossed contemptuously in the dumpster behind her house. Like the rusty junk she had always called them, this was the smart part of her attack. She thought she was establishing a pattern, a senile old woman clearing out clutter. But she had made a fatal error. The one thing not in the dumpster, the one thing missing entirely, was the lathe, the one item with actual, high monetary value. She thought she was covering her tracks. She had, in fact, signed her confession. She expected me to be hysterical. She expected me to run to her house, weeping and accusing, with no proof. She expected me to be the senile, forgetful woman who wouldn't even notice one specific tool was missing, or who would assume she'd misplaced it. She had no idea who I was. My heart did not race. My breathing was even. This was not a moment for grief. It was a moment for precision. I walked back into my house, past the cherry wood candlesticks he had turned, and went to my office. I went to the bookshelf, past the botany texts and the club ledgers, and pulled out my personal journal from 1972, tucked inside the back cover, pressed flat for 50 years, was a single, faded, handwritten piece of paper, the sentimental junk she could never have imagined. It was the original bill of sale for one Rockwell wood lathe, Model 46 hasta 111, and at the bottom, written in David's own clear, strong hand, was the serial number. I picked up the phone. I did not call Susan. I called the police. I reported a felony theft. I didn't say my neighbor did it. I simply stated that a high-value antique, with a specific serial number, had been stolen from my locked shed. The police, of course, were obligated to check with the neighbors. I watched from my window as 2 officers knocked on Susan's door. She answered, wrapped in her bathrobe, her face a perfect mask of neighborly concern. I saw her shake her head, her hands fluttering to her heart, and then I saw her tell the lie. I knew the exact lie she would tell. It was the only move she had. I walked outside, carrying my journal. I arrived just as the officer was thanking her. So you haven't seen anything unusual? And you're sure, mister? Miller never gave you any of his old tools. The officer was just doing his job. Susan saw me and her face tightened. But she smiled. A cruel, pitying smile. Oh, officer. Thank goodness. I was just telling him, she said, her voice dripping with sympathy. Margaret, dear, you must be so confused. That old thing David gave that to me years ago. Before he passed, he knew I'd use it, and he wanted it to have a good home. You just forgot. It was a brilliant performance. Her word against mine, the senile, grieving widow versus the concerned, helpful friend. This was her expectation, a guaranteed win. She had not planned on the archivist. That's a terrible lie. Susan, I said, my voice perfectly flat. The officers looked between us. Uncomfortable. But it's one we can clear up. I opened the journal. Officer, this is the original bill of sale from March 10th, 1972. I handed him the faded paper. You will find the make, model, and serial number. It proves we purchased it, but it doesn't prove it wasn't a gift. Susan's smirk widened. Exactly, she said. She's just confused. But this, I said, is where you made your mistake. I turned the page in my journal to where another piece of sentimental junk was kept. It was a photograph of David, standing proudly next to his lathe, holding up the first candlestick he ever made. On the back, in my own handwriting, was the date Christmas, 1985. I handed it to the officer. And this, I said, is a photo from our anniversary party, 5 years ago. I handed him another photo. David and me, older, smiling, standing next to the same lathe in the same shed. You've been my neighbor for 30 years. Susan, you told the officers he gave this to you before he died. He died 4 years ago. How? Exactly. Did he give you a gift that was still in our shed? Which we were photographing at our anniversary party. A year after you claim you received it? Susan's face collapsed. The blood drained from it. She had been caught in a stupid, greedy. Obviously. The officer looked at the photos. He looked at the receipt. He looked at Susan. His expression hardening. Ma'am, you told us he gave it to you. This evidence proves that is false. You also have a dumpster full of this woman's property. Her face began to tremble. I was just cleaning. She asked me to. She's senile, The officer held up his hand. Ma'am, you are under arrest for felony theft and for filing a false report. The sound of the handcuffs clicking, the sharp, metallic snap, was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. She was walked, in her bathrobe, to the police car, a public spectacle for the entire neighborhood. She was ruined, but I knew, as I watched the car pull away, this was not the end. She would make bail. She was a cornered animal, a criminal, with nothing left to lose. She had failed to take my legacy. Now, she would come for my home. Susan made bail in less than 12 hours. The criminal charge, the arrest, the handcuffs. I had thought that would be the end. A final, public humiliation. But for Susan, I learned, that was just the cost of doing business. The shame of being led away in her bathrobe had not broken her. It had annealed her rage into something hard and sharp. The neighborhood was silent, watching. My own sacrifice was my peace. I jumped at every noise. I had to double my blood pressure medication. I was a prisoner in my own home, sacrificing my health, waiting for the next strike from the animal I had cornered. She did not wait long. She escalated from my husband's tools to his monument, the 100-year-old oak tree at the edge of my garden. That tree was not just a tree. It was the anchor of our lives. David and I had our first picnic under it when we bought this house. 54 years ago. We had pushed our children, and then our grandchildren, on a tire swing that hung from its lowest branch. It was a living cathedral, a silent witness to our entire marriage, the keeper of our history. It was the one thing, more than the roses, that was David's legacy. And Susan, in her sociopathic brilliance, knew it. She had to destroy it. I thought of the winter of 2010, the blizzard that collapsed her carport under 2 feet of snow. She had been hysterical, claiming she was ruined. I remembered spending an entire afternoon, my own back aching, my own driveway, unshoveled, helping her die out. I had sacrificed my own safety and comfort. I had brought her hot soup. I had listened to her whine for hours. Oh, Margaret. She had wept. You are the only one I can count on. You are so strong. The vile contrast made me sick. While I was propping her up, she was measuring me for a coffin. She saw my strength, not as a virtue, but as a resource to be plundered before she set it on fire. I knew she would come for my home. After the arrest, I made a call, not to the police, but to my lawyer. I sacrificed another $2,000 from my savings, a money I had earmarked for a new roof. I need a preemptive restraining order. I told him, barring Susan Miller from touching my property, and I need you to pull the original town survey maps from the 1970s. My lawyer was confused. Margaret, a restraining order is defensive. Why not wait? Because, I said, my voice cold. She is not defensive. She is offensive, and I will not be surprised. I was an archivist, and I was a trapper. I was using my senile wisdom to lay a trap she could not see. The war arrived on a Tuesday. A large, yellow truck pulled up, a tree-cutting service, and behind it, Susan's car. She got out, not in a bathrobe, but in her power suit. She was smiling, a triumphant, venomous smile. She was joined by a man in a polo shirt, holding a clipboard. Margaret, she called out, her voice ringing with victory. Good morning. Just some essential property maintenance. This was her smart attack. The man in the polo shirt was a surveyor. He unrolled a large, newly printed digital map. "As you can see," he said, his voice slick, "our new GPS-enabled survey shows the property line is here. This oak tree," he tapped the map, "is, in fact, on Ms. Miller's property. She has a legal right to remove it." Susan's face was ecstatic. She had chainsaws. She had a legal document. She expected me to collapse, to weep, to beg. She expected to finally see me break. This was the guaranteed win. My heart did not race. My hands did not shake. I looked at the surveyor, at Susan, at the men with the chainsaws, who had now paused. Sensing the tension, I did not speak to Susan. I walked past her, as if she were a piece of furniture, and addressed the foreman of the tree-cutting crew, a man who looked like he ran a licensed, insured business. "Excuse me," I said politely. He nodded. I handed him a single, folded document. "Before you start," I said, "you should know this is a copy of a binding restraining order, filed 48 hours ago, barring Susan Miller from touching, or having anyone else touch, this tree, pending a court review." The foreman stopped. He took the paper. His legal obligation just shifted from his client to the court. Susan started to scream. "That's fake. It's paper. I have a digital map. He's a professional surveyor." The foreman ignored her. He was reading the order. "Ma'am," he said to me, "this is a restraining order, but she has a survey." "And I said, have this." I unrolled my own map. The sentimental junk. The original. Certified 1971 town plat map, bearing the embossed, official county seal. "This is the legal survey on file with the town, showing the original iron marker." I pointed to the grass. "The one your surveyor missed, which is right over there. Your new map is fraudulent." The foreman looked at my map. He looked at the restraining order. He looked at the screaming, frantic Susan. He was a professional. He would not risk his business and his license for her personal vendetta. "We're done here," he said to his crew. "Pack it up. This is a legal dispute, and we're not touching it." They began loading their equipment. Susan was left, standing on my lawn, screaming, "Don't you leave. I am paying you, I'll sue you." She was holding her useless, fake digital map. She had been publicly defeated. Again, by her own arrogance, and by my superior, old-fashioned preparation. She turned to me. Her face was no longer human. It was a mask of pure, psychotic rage. The suit, the map, the smart attacks, it was all gone. This was the final snap. She had lost all logic. She had been beaten by poison, by ledgers, by receipts, and now by maps. She had lost her reputation, her freedom, and her final smart attack. All that was left was impulse. All that was left was the table flip. As she stood there, vibrating, her eyes scanning my garden, I knew what would happen, and I knew I was ready. I went inside. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea. Just as I had the night she tried to poison my garden, I did not turn on the main lights. I went to my study, the one that overlooked the oak tree, and I sat in the dark. My peace of mind was the sacrifice. My home, my sanctuary, was no longer safe. It had been invaded by poison, by slander, by theft, and now by a failed legal assault. I was a 72-year-old widow, and I was being forced to live under siege, sacrificing my sleep, my health, my own sense of security, all because of a woman whose soul had been eaten alive by envy. I was sacrificing my golden years to a war I had never asked for. But I was not a victim. I was a trapper. I reached into my desk drawer and took out my iPad. I opened an app, a crystal clear, high-definition, night vision image of my back garden appeared. This was my useless hobby. Susan had often mocked me for it. Birdwatching. Margaret. Really, she had sneered just last summer. Don't you have anything better to do than stare at sparrows? It's so senile. I had sacrificed $500 money from my emergency fund for this birdwatching camera system 6 months ago. Right after the poison incident, I had told the installer I wanted it aimed at the rare orioles that nested in the oak. He had, at my Kiat direction, aimed it perfectly to cover my entire garden, the shared shed, and Susan's back door. While she was mocking my senile hobby, I was using my senile intellect to build the perfect, invisible cage. I sat. I waited. I sipped my tea. It took 2 hours. At precisely 1:17 in the morning, the motion sensor chimed. The screen lit up. And there she was. She was not the smart, suited woman from that afternoon. She was a thing of pure, animalistic rage. She was in her bathrobe, the same one she had been arrested in. She was carrying a shovel from her own garage. She stormed across the lawn, making no attempt to be quiet. And she began. She didn't just dig. She attacked. The first thud of the shovel was into the Mr. Lincoln roses, the ones David had planted for our 40th anniversary. I watched, my breathing perfectly even, as she hacked at their roots, screaming. The audio on the feed was perfect. "You think you're better than me," she was shrieking, her voice a raw, ugly tear in the night. "You and your perfect garden, your perfect husband, your perfect life," thud. The shovel blade bit into the earth. "I'll show you, disqualified hack. I'll show you, senile." She was destroying my legacy. Yes, but I felt nothing. No grief. No anger. The roses were already gone. What I felt was the cold, clean satisfaction of the archivist. She was not just vandalizing my property. She was, at last, providing the final, indeniable, audio-recorded confession. I remembered all of it, every sacrifice. The $2,000 I spent on the lawyer for the restraining order, the 50 years I had spent preserving David's bill of sale, the 20 years of unpaid, thankless labor for the garden club, the 30 years of kindness I had shown her, saving her tomatoes, giving her my best seedlings, enduring her insults, while I was sacrificing my entire adult life to be a good friend, a good wife, a good community member. She was keeping her own ledger, a ledger of pure, black, zimmering hate, and now she was paying her bill. I picked up my phone. I did not lower the volume on the iPad. 911. "What is your emergency?" My neighbor, Susan Miller, is at my home, I said, my voice perfectly flat. "She is in my backyard, actively destroying my property with a shovel, in violation of a restraining order. File number 729. Ma'am, are you safe?" "I am perfectly safe," I said. "I am in my study, watching her on a high-definition, night vision camera. She is currently attacking a rose bush. She appears to be screaming that I am perfect." There was a moment of silence on the line. "A camera." "Ma'am." "Yes," I said, "and it records audio. The police who arrested her for felony theft last week. Officers Riley and Kent. Will be familiar with her. The police arrived in 3 minutes. They did not use their sirens. They parked down the street and walked, just as I knew they would. Susan was still in a frenzy. She was covered in mud and rose thorns, sobbing and hacking. A feral créature. Police dropped the shovel. The beam of a flashlight hit her. She froze, blinded. The shovel raised. She looked insane. "It's her!" she shrieked, pointing at my dark window. "She's the one. She's senile. She's been tormenting me. It was the same lie. Her only lie. She's confused. She doesn't know what she's doing." I walked out my front door, my iPad in my hand. I walked onto my lawn, the screen glowing. The officers turned. "Ma'am, please go back inside." "Of course, officer," I said, "but you should see this." I turned the iPad so they could see the screen. I rewound the footage exactly 2 minutes. I hit play. The entire scene replayed for them, in crystal clear night vision, with perfect audio. They watched themselves arrive. They watched Susan, just moments before, hacking at my garden. They heard her screaming, "I'll show you disqualified. I'll show you senile." Susan stared at the screen. She stared at the moving, screaming image of herself. She stared at the proof. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She had been beaten by botany, by bookkeeping, by receipts, by maps, and now, finally, by a senile old woman's useless bird-watching camera. Officer Riley didn't even speak to her. He just pulled out the handcuffs. "Susan Miller, you are under arrest for felony vandalism, criminal trespass, and violation of a court-issued restraining order." The sound of the handcuffs clicking, for the second time, was the end. Her war was over. She had lost everything. The theft charge from the lathe was now combined with this. She had no defense. She had provided the prosecution's entire case. She lost her house. She was forced to sell her perfect home, the one she had looked out of with such envy, to pay the legal fees and the court-ordered restitution for the damage to my garden and for the theft of David's lathe. I watched, from my window, as the sold sign went up. I used the restitution money to buy a new oak tree, even larger than the last, and to replant my roses. I learned that true strength isn't just about enduring. It's not about being the kindest person in the room. True strength is about knowing your own value. It is about keeping your own ledgers. It is about knowing that sentimental junk is often the most powerful weapon, and it is about knowing, when you are pushed too far, that you have every right to push back, using the very weaknesses your enemy mistakes for stupidity. Have you ever had a neighbor or a friend whose jealousy became toxic? How did you handle it? Comment below and let me know if this story resonated with you. Please like, subscribe, and share with someone who might need a reminder that the most old-fashioned virtues, diligence, patience, and meticulous record-keeping are often the most powerful weapons of all. Thank you for being part of this journey. And remember, never, ever, let anyone mistake your kindness for weakness.